Today on Rebuilders, we couldn't resist the opportunity to talk about some big things. One big thing in particular that's happened in the world in the last couple of days.
We are talking about the Trump presidency, the inauguration. It's a bigger deal than we realise. It is the beginning of a new order. How do we get our heads around it? What does it mean? What does it look like when Wall Street, Silicon Valley, Washington, the Pentagon come together with a new maximalist vision, which may take us to Mars? What does this mean? How's it going to change the world? And how do we respond as the people of God? All that and more.
Yeah, it's a big episode and we look forward to sharing it with you right now. Welcome to Rebuilders. My name is Liddy and I'm here with Mark and Daniel. How are you guys?
Great. Ooh, snap.
Yeah.
I'm great and you're good.
Happy New Year, everyone.
Yeah.
Happy 2025.
Yes.
We're back.
We are back. How was your Christmas end of year breaks?
Not too bad. Pretty quiet.
Yeah.
How about you, Daniel?
Caught up with some of my wife's family. And I also, for the first time ever in my life, I went to Canberra.
You've never been to
I've never been to Canberra.
Haven't you?
No.
Never. And you basically grew up next door.
I did not.
Well, a few hours away.
Canberra's great.
It's it's a great city. It's such a weird city though.
It's a weird city, but
Like,
I
different,
love it.
different weird.
Yeah, and shout out to all our Canberra listeners.
Yes, I'm sorry I haven't visited. I'm keen to go. I want to go
It's
to the
great.
gallery.
You've got to go. It's an Australian. Yeah, it's
Australian icon.
it's iconic. Yeah. For those who don't know, Melbourne and Sydney had a rivalry for many years, and the capital sort of moved around, and so effectively they built a city in between the two, which is Canberra, to be the national capital. Although, as a Victorian from Melbourne, it's closer to Sydney than it is to Melbourne.
It is bizarre because you kind of drive through paddocks and then suddenly you're there.
Yeah, you're in this city.
Yeah, in the middle of New South Wales.
Yeah. Did you go to Parliament House?
I went. I had one night there, so I got up early in the
spent
morning.
the night in Parliament House.
yes. I got up early in the morning. Went for a run up the War Memorial Lane thing, whatever it's called.
Yeah.
Then back down to Parliament House, and that's how I explored. Yeah,
Did you know that when you look from the Prime Minister's office in the old Parliament House towards the War Memorial, there's red little rocks.
Yeah, someone was telling me this.
Yeah, which is so basically if the Prime Minister was to declare war, I think there's two streets. I think there's the Constitution Street and then the King Street. So it's like you basically got to make sure the Constitution agrees and the Parliament or whatever, but it's red because you'll be spilling the blood of Australians.
Yeah.
In fact, a lot of interesting symbolism in our national capital.
Yeah. No, it was good. Love to go back there.
Well, speaking of politics and capitals.
Subtle.
Go on.
What are we talking about today, Liddy?
We are talking about the minimal amount of things that have happened since the beginning of 2025. I guess in particular, we're talking about the inauguration.
Yes.
That happened merely days ago.
And can I just say, we did have a break there from Rebuilders, which we all needed. But I've got to admit, I was sitting there on holidays and like January the 1st starts and it's just like massive news story after massive news story.
Yeah.
And I would go into my cupboard and just pretend to do a Rebuilders by myself. I had created you guys out of
muttering away
some blankets placed over brooms and we had some great episodes.
Made our faces out of cereal boxes. I'd like to be cornflakes, please.
Yes.
I'd like to be a fly on a wall.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah.
Well, let's get into it. So kicking us off, or on our way in, the year woke broke more spectacularly than we imagined.
Okay, so we did an episode, was it near the end of last year?
It was the second last episode.
The second last episode called, 2024 was the year that woke broke. And I think like in preparing for that episode, I'm like, I tried to, just as
I've
Liddy
just spilt tea on
baptizes
myself.
herself with her tea.
Continue, we're all good.
That, like you're making a prediction that woke, for however you want to define that, as a sort of social ideological force was sort of, falling over. But in preparing for that episode, it did feel like, you make a prediction here, he's going out on a bit of a limb. But I think like as moving up to really what is a new presidency, but sort of this moment in the world's history, it's just been absolutely staggering, that sort of prediction and what's happened. And just a few things around that. I think that what's really, really interesting is we've definitely now moved out of a period into a new one. So, a lot of what we're going to talk about today is grey zone is a concept that we've spoken about a lot in here. I wrote about it in Non-Anxious Presence. And grey zone is really the time in between political orders, which really define culture, social life, us, the big and the small. And, I think I spoke about at the end of last year, we seem to be moving out of a grey zone into something. And I think we are now moving into a new order. And, however you want to define the last order, woke, for want of a better word, was part of that. And you could see that this sort of way of looking at the world was definitely, there was a backlash happening. The election of Donald Trump, again, for the second time, definitely was in part inspired by people who wanted to vote for him, but a large part of it was actually people who, you'd see a lot of interviews and stuff like that. People didn't like him, but it was seen as a pushback against, that sort of agenda. But I think since then, I've just been absolutely staggered at how quickly things have moved. Mark Zuckerberg's, I'm just going to call it his sort of conversion moment, which has been happening for a while. He sort of, he appeared at those sort of Senate hearings or something, and he sort of looked like I don't mean to be mean, but, like very stiff, and I was going to say robotic. And there were memes around that, and I don't mean that disparagingly, but he appeared hard to relate to through his demeanor. And, he's grown his hair out, he's wearing different clothes and so on. But, he went on the Joe Rogan show and then made this video. But it was fascinating, the video. He's almost completely sort of realigned, And there was an interview, there was an article in the New York Times, and it was about this change. And, a lot of people saw this as sort of a barefaced alignment with the new political order. Perhaps the threat of the government coming against him, was part of this. And we'll never know his true motivations, only he does, and the people around him. But this reporter who'd spoken to a lot of people in his inner circle said he's genuinely gone through a swing to the right, and you look at even Rogan now, who people talk about in that sort of, sphere of influence, was, he didn't vote for Trump early on. You go back a few years, he's not voting, and Musk, people don't realize, or people forget rather, he was donating to the Democrats, voted for the Obamas. So we've seen this huge shift, and we'll talk about this more, but a shift of Silicon Valley to the right.
Sure.
And I think what surprised me is in the interview, Zuck said, he's talking about they're not going to do censorship like they did. They're going to do community notes like X has, or formerly Twitter. But he made this comment too. He goes, we're not going to sort of block certain things that's criticizing immigration or gender. And then you sort of had this realization, which you knew this, but I think I'd not heard it so barely faced put, that, so much of the culture of wokeism, so much of the culture of the last 10 years has been shaped because those who control social media platforms could point the algorithms in particular ideological directions. And and obviously when Musk took over X, you saw it switch, from Jack Dorsey to Musk, and you can argue was the transformation of X one of the things that actually helped Donald Trump win the election? Is it a factor? Probably. But I think what I was staggered by, it seemed like when that happened, that X was an outlier and there's all these things that X is going to fall over and so on. But to see Zuckerberg, who really in many ways was sort of seen as part of the resistance, or his platform was seen part of the resistance to Trumpism, to see him just flip and then to make this comment around censorship, you realize that, hang on, the algorithms are now going to point in the opposite direction. So the algorithms of Twitter used to point towards the sort of woke ideology or whatever, Facebook, Instagram. And then interestingly, we've had the whole thing around TikTok. Can I just say I was right? I predicted the banning of
that's a deep cut.
It's a deep cut, and it only lasted for 5 hours or something. But I was right.
Cross that on a rebuilder's bingo card.
Yes, I had to wait a long time. People have been sending emails in about that prediction. Sorry. But even interestingly now to see really the alignment of TikTok, there's 90 days where they've got to have to align, with Trumpism and people up on TikTok saying there's certain things you can't put into TikTok now, which is sort of like, censorship around Trump. So really what you've seen is, and I think this is going to have huge impact, more than people realize, and it's going to have impact outside of America. A lot of what we're going to talk about today is in 2016 when Trump won, obviously had a massive effect within America. This time it's going to affect the world in greater ways. And being in Australia, and obviously everything we're saying here, we're not Americans, we're Australians. A lot of this is going to be about the rest of the world and the effect on the rest of the world because of all these changes. But there was a sense this stuff that sort of seemed contained to America, I would go over there and you're like, between, when Trump became president, you're like, okay, that's different to what's happening back home.
Yeah.
But I think what's going to happen is this shift is going to have a trickle-down effect. So number one, what does it look like when the algorithms of TikTok, whatever happens with that, Insta, Facebook, X, the major platforms, and there will be pressure on the other ones, as we were talking about before we went on air. Reddit's still sort of fighting a bit of a resistance campaign, but pressure's going to come against that. We've seen how an ideology grows. What does it look like when the algorithms are pointed in another direction? So that's going to radically change culture. So folks, stuff's going to change. The second thing that's been just absolutely amazing is this Silicon Valley switch has also been a Wall Street switch where even before Trump's inauguration, you saw a number of the corporates, the big corporations in the world, like the asset management firm BlackRock, JP Morgan, one of the world's biggest banks, ditch their diversity, equity, inclusion policies, their net zero policies, or ESG policies. And this is going to have a trickle-down effect. I was in Sydney last week, or something, and just walk around this sort of business part of Sydney, and everyone's there. JP Morgan, Blackstone, all these companies are there, Amazon, and to realize that so much of their corporate culture affects Sydney, which then has a flow-on effect to the rest of Australia. Now, I remember being at a conference, being in a Hilton in downtown San Francisco in 2016, 2017. And there was staff coming, it was a large global corporation, and there was staff coming from all around the world to this massive event, thousands of people there. And I wasn't at the conference, I just was staying in the hotel. And, it was a conversation with one of the people. And basically this whole group from around the world, managers, influencers in this global corporation, were then going through sort of diversity, inclusion training around LGBTQI issues. Now so what would happen is, someone in Sydney would go on this conference to America and they're driving what culture looks like in the workplace. And for the last 8 years, it has been around some of these things. That's going to change now, so still probably people sitting in offices in Ottawa or Auckland or wherever, that hasn't trickled down. But you're seeing the algorithms of the social networks are pointing in a direction. The corporate culture is now pointing in a different direction. And I think you're going to start to see that even in entertainment and so on.
Yeah.
So it's going to be absolutely fascinating. And part also of what happened, and this is why for those of us outside of America, particularly I think the English-speaking world, American foreign policy, a lot of aid and stuff was linked to around some of these issues, like we'll let you borrow money. And interestingly, Trump actually brought some of that in his first thing, which a lot of people don't know. But what you're now going to see is with the effect of people like Elon Musk, is that you're now going to see, and you're hearing messaging from some of the people around Trump is, well, we may not deal with an ally like Canada, who we've always dealt with, because we actually don't like their politics. So the effect of American power as the world's preeminent global superpower before was pushing towards, more to the left. It's now going to swing to the right. So 3 huge planks there: the algorithms, corporate culture, and that'll flow into HR, local government. 3, American power, and the political culture will change. When you sort of had this third way political culture change where you had people like Bill Clinton and Tony Blair arrive on the scene. Bill Clinton went on, I think it was the Arsenio Hall show, and played the saxophone, maybe wearing sunglasses. I, in my mind, have him wearing sunglasses. And that was shocking at the time. People were like, oh, this is so cool. This is very different. That was not something a presidential candidate did.
Yeah.
And it brought in this sort of like different kind of politics. When Tony Blair, I think he just won the prime ministership in England, he had Oasis come to number 10 Downing Street. That was all very new. And that created the sort of Blairs, Clintons, created a new kind of politics that everyone around the world then copies. And then you had a similar thing. You had your sort of Trudeau, Jacinda Ardern. These sort of people sort of had. It was almost a resistance to Trump politics. Mm-hmm. But having seen those people fall now, and obviously again another sort of woke breaking thing was the sort of resignation of Justin Trudeau. Is that political culture will change. So this is going to have massive effects. It won't dribble down just yet to the rest of the world, but it's going to definitely happen. Which is really interesting. One other thing I would say too is another dynamic which is fascinating at this moment. And I'll stop in a second. I've got more to offer, but there's just so many things. There's almost a new cancel culture. So I think what you're going to see is you're going to see the cancel culture of people being cancelled because they said something politically incorrect. And the sort of, you almost had this sort of frontier justice a little bit on the internet, which started with things like Gamergate and so on, where people would call that person out for it. They said something sexist or racist, and then it's sort of like, you said something racist 22 years ago and we found the clip of that. That's going to change, but it's going to mutate into something different. So it's going to be less around sort of woke issues, for want of a better term. But it's fascinating how you've now got Elon Musk, the world's richest man, who one thing that happened over the sort of Christmas period was that in the United Kingdom around over 10 years ago, there was this scandal around these grooming gangs in certain cities, some in the Britain's north, where there were people of, different immigrant groups, mainly Pakistani immigrants to the UK, who'd been involved in sexual abuse of some children. And there was a sense that this was covered up or not investigated in the way that it should have because there was fears around racism. Story in the UK. Musk jumps on this and uses it really, and that's not to say it's a legitimate issue. I'm not debating that at all. Yeah. But it's interesting that normally if there was something that was happening in the north of England as a story there, people in America weren't really jumping on that. But Elon Musk, because Keir Starmer, the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, had first of all sent people to volunteer for the Democrats. And also I think it's one of his guys who works for him, one of his advisors, also had an online anti-digital hate sort of NGO who was actually actively, someone leaked the documents, I think they were actively trying to undermine Elon Musk. He's now, right, I'm coming after Starmer. So all of a sudden this story, which previously would have been a domestic story in the UK, now all of a sudden all these American people on the right are wanting to talk about these grooming gangs in the UK, and Keir Starmer comes under tremendous political pressure. So if you're in Australia or if you're in the UK or Canada or wherever, you're less likely to have your domestic stories become international. But that's now happening. So it's like the new kind. So to give you one more example, we've got the Australian Open on at the moment in Melbourne, the tennis, and there's a local sports reporter for Channel 9 called Tony Jones who would have some sway in Melbourne, but no one would care outside of Australia and probably outside of Melbourne. And long story short, on the live feed, he sort of was criticising Novak Djokovic. And all of a sudden this blows up and Novak Djokovic responds. Novak Djokovic makes a video. Elon Musk then retweets it on X. Millions of people see this. And all of a sudden this local Melbourne sports reporter is now part of this international maelstrom. And there's calls overseas for his sacking, right? So you've got this new kind of dynamic where issues in the rest of the world, which would have been ignored. So your local city councillor from Bendigo, naming your former hometown there, Liddy.
Yes, thank you.
Could say something in a YouTube meeting, at a local council meeting, and Elon Musk could pick it up or someone online and it goes viral. And then there's consequence now about that. So it's this fascinating new dynamic that's happening in the world, and it's putting actual tremendous pressure. So in the past, people in America didn't care what was happening with Canadian politics. there was a lot of interest in Trudeau falling. There's a lot of interest in the British Labor Party. And our Prime Minister, went out the other day and was like, Elon Musk, don't look at us. We've got foreign interference laws. And the response from the Australian public was almost like, shh, don't say anything. He might see us. So this is a new kind of moment. So what I'm saying here is you're going to see an increasing overseas assertion of this new order in new particular ways. And maybe I'll sort of just bring this long answer to an end, but to say this, like it feels like a Constantine moment. So Constantine, the emperor of Rome, people talk about the pre-Constantinian church and the post-Constantinian church. There's a lot of people who will align with the political order, not because they're a true believer, but because it's what gets you ahead in your job. You don't get censored in public. It's beneficial for you economically. And it feels like what's happened literally since we did What Woke Us Broke episode at the end of last year, and particularly since the inauguration, is a lot of people, it's like Constantine becomes a Christian. So it's like Trump in a very aggressive, assertive way has initiated a new order. And what you've seen is previously in 2016, there was massive resistance from Wall Street, Silicon Valley, parts of his own administration. That's all gone now. And it's almost like people who were anti-woke, like the people who were pagan in the Roman Empire and like, Constantine's a Christian now, or we're going to become Christian, start going to church because it benefits us. It's almost like we've had a moment like that. So it's a hugely, hugely consequential happening in a far more dramatic way that even I anticipated. And I mean, two more. To see Snoop Dogg, who someone's putting videos of him just like attacking anyone who would sort of, or other rappers who would be he's like, who's going to be, I mean, he's used much more colourful language than I am here. Who's going to be the first one to sort of sell out and perform for Trump? And then he's playing at the inauguration. The Village People, are they the same guys?
I have no idea.
I mean, because I wouldn't know. You could replace them all and I would never know. And I reckon 99% of the population don't know. Daniel's looking that up. I'm sure they've had
only one.
Only one original.
Is the only Victor Willis.
A band where the uniforms are more emblematic than the actual singers.
Yeah.
But when Trump started using YMCA, the Village People sent him, I think, a cease and desist letter. They're going to sue him. And you go from that to now they're playing at the inauguration and he's dancing with them. Like phenomenal coming to the beginning of a new order where the sort of like, the power elites, you've got the population, the power elites have now shifted, and this is going to have huge implications for the world.
It's interesting just kind of watching this, and I'm not deep diving as much as you are into the different things going on, but it's just different. This feels different, like this inauguration and to 2017. Like I remember back then, it was just kind of this shock factor of like, like this guy is okay. All right, this is different. Whereas this time it feels like, all right, we kind of know. I know some history there, I suppose, but there's just it's amazing how many people are coming in alongside of him.
Yes.
It's just you talked about so these are just general comments from Daniel.
No, it's great.
You talked about the new kind of, are we coming out of that grey zone into new era? And it's just one thought, like thinking about the last century, and a lot of the kind of global conflicts and that kind of stuff have been to do with different democracy versus communism versus fascism or whatever, different things, different kind of more political ideologies. Whereas it seems like there's a shift now. It's more of alignment with still ideology, but kind of power bases, less so than different kind of political things. Is that accurate? Would that be an accurate kind of assessment, or am I heading down a dark?
Or is it? I mean, maybe we'll get to this later, but almost I would say it's almost a return to real politic. And like before it was like, oh, we'll make this virtuous statement and it's not going to affect anything.
Yeah.
And, you know, whereas this is like, okay, now we're really, you know, it's like we're talking about the game. Now you're in the middle of the wrestling match getting hit. This feels, you know, and again, to a lot of the themes, you know, we've talked about here of, you know, shifting from, you know, a world of sort of idealism to realism, that's just what happened, you know.
Yes.
And there was a moment too, I don't know if you saw, so Jimmy Carter's funeral, President Jimmy Carter's funeral was a couple of days before or whatever, I can't remember exact timing. But there was this dismay you saw from a lot of people on the left or people who've been part of what's called the resistance, where, you know, like people like Obama and all this, you know, standing up to Trump and sort of saying, you know, like he's a fascist and blah, blah. I mean, maybe not said the exact words, but many others did. And then there was the footage of, you know, the president's come in and Kamala sits down. Basically, none of the Dems talked to Kamala. It was very clear, you know, people, again, were speculating, but there seemed to be tension between the Bidens and Kamala. And then Obama just sits with Trump and they're joking around. You know, and I saw a number of people online going, you asked me to fight this fight and you guys are just like buddy now. Like, was he Hitler or was he not? You know, so I think that there is this moment of huge, the other side of this is like it's a different kind of, like 2016 was like, wow, that's a shocking defeat, but we're still going to fight. So I think I saw some stats, I can't remember the exact stats, but you know, in 2016 across America, there was something like 5.4 million people marched against him. Part of that was the Women's March, etc. There was a march, I think maybe in New York or somewhere, and it was tiny. I can't remember, it was like 50,000 or 5,000 or something, but it was minuscule. So the resistance thing here is so much smaller, which is fascinating and shows you the scale of change operating here. You know, and yes, I mean, I guess what I'm saying too is, you know, if you're this is a historical world shift we are seeing here. And this is not a blip. Last time it felt like is this a crazy blip? You know? This is now, the order has shifted in ways I'm in profound shock as someone who studies these shifts of how big this shift is.
Do you reckon, are we already starting to see it? Other countries kind of shift towards this more, this kind of approach to politics and rather than going through traditional means of election or whatever, there's going to be I don't know, people just doing wild things.
Well, I mean,
to get to power and that kind of stuff.
I mean, let's look at the European Union. You know, traditionally, the three most powerful people in the European Union was Britain, who then left, France, who's in disarray, in real crisis. Macron is in many ways a lame duck. Scholz in Germany, a chancellor who's the economic model of Germany is fundamentally broken because of gas and so Europe's in crisis. And in many ways, I think it was The Economist or something just put out a power ranking for Europe. And Giorgia Meloni, who is the leader of Italy, she's the Queen of Europe now, really, politically. And then yesterday, I think it was yesterday, she said, you know, the capital of Europe should move from Brussels back to Rome, you know. So almost there's this now the EU was sort of seen as this globalist thing. There's almost now the right and Europe are starting to talk about we need back to a European empire to counter America. You know, you look at Javier Milei in Argentina, you know, Bukele or whatever. Now, so there's outliers starting to happen. Obviously, you know, Orbán in Hungary. You see some of that on the left in other places over the last few years. But I think you've seen that, and I talked about the autocracies. What's happening now, and this is relevant for many of our audience are Americans, but also many are Australians, Brits, Kiwis, Canadians, and Europeans. I think the shock is now going to be the effect that, like, what does this look like in those countries? Let's call them the other liberal democracies. And, you know, Justin Trudeau stood down, and there's now a leadership battle in the Liberal Party in Canada, and it's just fascinating. So, is it Christina Freeland or whatever was his economy minister, but he sacked, and that's led to part of his downfall. She was at a rally, and she sort of it was on, maybe it was worse on online because often they capture things, but she sort of tried to speak in this different way, which was, we've now got to fight, and it was just someone not used to acting in that way, trying to do it.
Yeah.
So I think the political culture is going to change. And you think about centre-left governments like ours, you think about groups like the Teals, which is a political movement in Australia. How do they cope with this new reality when all the biggest companies in the world are pulling away from these climate change things? And America's just like net zero, nah. China's nah. Russia's got a secret, fleet of oil tankers going around the world. What do you do when everyone's doing it and when it's actually So anyway, it's absolutely fascinating, the shift. But I think your instincts are right. This is very, very different.
Yeah.
One of the next things that you're sort of moving towards is talking about it being a response, or this shift is a response to the crisis of the old order.
Yeah.
You were just talking about Trudeau stepping down, and there's this guy, Mark Carney, who's sort of vying for leadership of his party.
Yeah. Well, he said, Mark Carney said something interesting, and he's trying to, be the leader of the Liberal Party in Canada and hopefully Prime Minister. He was the head of the Bank of England, which is the British Reserve Bank. And so he's as normie institutional as you get. Part of Trudeau's, linked into Trudeau's party, at the heart of these economic institutions, wealthy guy. And, he said recently, he gave this speech and it was we watched it actually before we came on, and you made the joke that it was like Seinfeld, when Jerry Seinfeld acts really morbid.
Pretends to be really serious.
Yeah, really. And it was almost like a lead balloon in the room. And I wrote down what he said. He said, he's saying to, Canadians, old times, my friend, are over. Our times are anything but ordinary. The system is not working as it should, and it's not working as it could. I found that stunning. Like, you're not going to get that going viral because it's not something. But when you've got someone totally institutional, totally at the heart of Canadian politics, was at the heart of the British economic system, saying the system is not working, that is a major admission. And I think part of what's going on here, part of why you've seen this, isn't just because, hey, woke got smashed and Trumpism's here and let's all wear a MAGA hat. Part of what's happening, and again, this is not just happening in the world, is that this is the fall of, we've talked about many of these issues, this is the fall of progressive neoliberalism in the world. The economic and social model that we had is failing. And that's I just saw some data around what Australians are interested in. I think it was the Red Bridge Group or whatever who did data and analytics in Australia, said the two number one top issues are cost of living, housing, massive issues. That is not working for people anymore. So this sort of theme that we've been running for 20 years, which worked, which facilitated a kind of lifestyle, a kind of politics, it's in huge trouble. And, we were talking before we came on air, and we won't go into it, but just the sort of emblematic, and I know it's not emblematic for people living through it, but the sort of governance crisis of the fires in LA was just like almost, again, I hate to say it, like a Hollywood movie. I thought of the movie The Day of the Locust. It was the Nathaniel West novel that John Schlesinger made a movie of in the 70s, and at the end scene is like Hollywood catches on fire, and it's almost this sort of biblical judgment. I'm not saying that was a biblical judgment against those parts of LA, but to see sort of this democratic donor stronghold, Hollywood, culturally influential, economically influential area, and then it's struggling with really basic elements of governance under this sort of democratic government in California, which really was emblematic of this old regime of the progressive side socially and the neoliberal side economically, was just incredible. And again, to Trudeau's fall, Trudeau was really seen as the alternate Trump. We talk about Jacinda Ardern here probably because Australia and New Zealand are close, but Trudeau was the anti-Trump. And to see him fall in such a way, was just fascinating. And part of there is this crisis now. And I saw another interesting article in the Times, and Rachel Reeves, who's the Chancellor of the Exchequer, basically the finance minister for the United Kingdom, got a lot of her sort of leaders around, or, public servants and stuff, and was basically like, you guys need to cut regulations and find new ways to grow, because the British economy is in huge trouble. And like we've got so many regulations. So something that did illustrate this previous era, which is falling over, is over-regulation. And so you can see Trump and Musk in particular, Vivek Ramaswamy was part of it, but he's now gone, was actually to cut these regulations. And again, what we're seeing is, this is the shock again. I'm sort of talking about the rest of the liberal democratic world here, is America's like, it's like what Trump's done is flipped this switch and is now running full steam ahead in this very different direction. But if you're Australia, if you're Canada, if you're New Zealand, if you're a local government, a state government somewhere, a provincial government somewhere, if you're running a local Australian corporation, this is going to be such a neck breaker for you. It's going to be really, really difficult. So it's like this switch from almost, I want to call it let's call it the passive aggressive power of progressive neoliberalism, where it's like, well, we're going to give you 2 weeks off work because you said something inappropriate in that meeting, to like, now it's like, we're going to invade Panama. It's sort of from raw, like passive aggressive power to raw power. And part of this as well is that things like, part of this is also, part of the crisis is, I think what's happened as well is a lot of people in America have realized, corporates, Silicon Valley, the Pentagon, government, that they are in a new Cold War with China, Russia, this axis, Iran, Venezuela, whatever, and North Korea. And I think they've gone like, we cannot do these things where we're going to limit the amount of energy that we produce, or have EV subsidies for these things, because China is just beating us and beating us and beating us. So that's partially, I think, also what's driven this change. That's not to say these things are going to have massive effects, but that's partially what's going on. So part of this is happening. In 2016, it was like, hold tight, this is a blip, believe in the institutions, trust the authorities. But now you've seen, I heard one person say that it reminded them of in Ireland, the Catholic Church was super powerful. And then in the 90s, there was a number of scandals involving sexual abuse, and you just saw the hollowing out of the Catholic Church's influence in Ireland. And this person said they're seeing the same thing now with government and liberal democratic institutions. So it's this shift, and Ireland shifted ideologically. So I think that's what we're seeing as well.
On the shift thing, we've talked a number of times about being in this sort of vibe shift moment. And you're suggesting that perhaps we're moving from a vibe shift to just a shift.
Yes. And I think this is a really important point I want to make, that a lot of people, particularly people, many people who are Christians listen to this podcast, and leaders and stuff like that. And there's a natural thing that's what's captured a lot of people's attention is the culture war element, woke, et cetera, and a lot of the conversations around the vibe shift have been about an openness to spirituality.
Yep.
And maybe actually we'll talk more about that in the coming weeks. I've done some more thinking about that. A spiritual openness vibe shift, that's part of it. But also it's this vibe shift away from woke. There was an interesting article. One of the sort of conversation in the English-speaking world is like, Trumpism for boomers and the young people are progressive. But what we're seeing now, and it was already happening in Europe, like your average further right voter in Europe is a young person, and your sort of moderate centre-left is an old person. But that's now happening in the West. The New York Times had an article today, fascinating, which was basically, I might even have it here, a lot of liberal parents, where was it? I've lost it. But, here we go. New York Times, when your son goes MAGA, some liberal parents now face a new unexpected challenge. How do you talk to children who voted for Donald J. Trump? That was not the conversation that was happening for the last 10 years. This conservatism was seen as a dying vestige of older people. So that's part of the vibe shift as well. That there's many churches I'm talking to who have been pitching their message towards what they thought was their progressive secular city, and then they got young people rocking up who actually are much to the right of them, and it's a shock. So how do you then pitch your message to them, or minister to them, preach the gospel to them, et cetera, et cetera. But I think what I'm saying here is I feel there's the vibe shift is just the first part of this. What is more consequential here is the massive structural shifts that are going on. And, there's been we've talked on here before about historical parallels, and I've been trying to get my head around, is this like the 70s where you had inflation, cost of living crisis, the economy sort of ran aground, the prosperity era after World War II disappeared, and then there was sort of Reaganism and Thatcherism and so on, or is it like the 30s where it sort of had the return of fascism and communism and Bolshevism and, on the verge of a world war. But interestingly, I began to read a bit over there. I had this sense that, and particularly since, the last week, and when Trump started talking about Greenland and Panama Canal and Canada and all this sort of stuff, is we're actually, I think, returning to a very maximalist American vision that you saw at the beginning of the 20th century.
Yeah.
So you had, Reconstruction after the Civil War, and then you sort of had this explosion of capitalism, and that then led to, people like the Rockefellers building Standard Oil, JP Morgan, all these bankers, the Vanderbilts, DuPonts, all these sort of people who really were oligarchs of the day. And then you had this pushback because they had these monopolies over oil. Standard Oil was broken up into multiple companies. You had these journalists like Ida Tarbell, this journalist, and she wrote against these companies, broke up Standard Oil. The railroads were broken up and so on. And really what was happening there was that government pushed back against corporations to get power. It was a power battle between the two.
Yeah.
And really up until the Great Depression, it was this toing and froing, government versus capital. And also what was happening at that time, you had this other movement, which is called the progressive movement. And the progressive movement, the early progressive movement, and you can get mistaken if you think about our current progressive movement, how we'd use that word, was really coming out of Victorianism. So Victorianism was really the moral code of Victorianism. It was very much centered around the family. It was centered around the rightness of morals. You could say it was almost a secularization of what happened in the Great Awakenings with Methodism. And then you had progressivism. But what progressivism was, it was the middle class. It was managers, white-collar workers in the middle class who wanted to bring a moral revolution to the rich because the rich were seen as being decadent.
Yeah.
Divorces went up amongst rich. The fertility rate went down amongst rich. They were throwing ostentatious parties in New York. But then there's also this other fear that, the poor are drinking too much and they're living these lascivious lifestyles. So you had this sort of Victorian-ish middle class, and then also they started to become very educated. The women's movement begins in this middle class, but it wasn't so much a political movement as it was a moral movement. We want them. And it was all about education. And you go from the Methodist revival conference camp meeting to the progressives would have their own versions of it where people would gather and they'd sing songs, and it had sort of a Christian element at some times, but it was like, here's how you can educate your children better. Here's how women can enter into the workplace. And what happened was, this is where prohibition comes from. They were like, well, stop drinking then. And it became a political force. And in some ways, what you realize is this is what wokeism has been. It's been a middle class moral crusade. It's not by the super richest. It really sort of came from people who are educated. It's been really about the managers and the HR people and so on. Yes, governments jumped on it. But what happened in the sort of beginning of the 20th century is there was a massive pushback against it. People felt like they'd overstretched and the progressive movement collapsed. That's very similar to what's happened now.
Sure.
And then what you had at the end of that then was this American maximalism where the corporations really came back into power, but they wedded with government. And so you saw these American expanded its territories, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, Colombia, there's a province of Panama. They wanted to build a canal through Panama. And so like people in Wall Street funded, sort of military expeditions and an independence movement in Panama, and they built the Panama Canal. And there was a sense of expanding the frontier of America. So that frontier myth came back, but this time it was sort of capital and the military and the Marines would go in and do stuff. So it's just fascinating. I'm reading this stuff. It feels now like you got presidents talking about needing to have the Panama Canal. There's all this sort of expansionism because American industry is growing and they need energy and resources and oil and Cuba and all this is part of it. And that's where we're back to. We're back to a sort of maximalist power. And what's really interesting for people as well is so much of the conversation in America when it comes to politics, it's like Democrats who like big government and Republicans who don't like big government but are much more pro-corporation. But really what we are seeing here is quite remarkable. And I think what you're seeing now is an interlocking of government and big business. And so it's the worst fear of the Democrats or people on the left who fear the overreach of massive corporations, their monopolies and their power. But it's also the fear of big government because what you're seeing is this, it's the two together.
Yeah.
And you saw that. And it's been fascinating. Steve Bannon, who's really been one of the sort of architects of Trumpism, if you listen to his interviews of late, the guy's clearly freaking out. He called Zuckerberg a criminal. He attacked Musk. And he's freaking out because his vision is economic nationalism of the people of Appalachia who've been left behind and destroyed by globalization. And he's now seeing the inauguration, and the front row is not senators and Congress people. It's Bezos's wife. It's the heads of Google. It's TikTok guy is there. It's Arnault, who's the head of Louis Vuitton. He's not even American, the head of Louis Vuitton. We saw just before we came on here, Masayashi's son, or whatever the guy's name is, the head of SoftBank, the Japanese investment firm, just rocked up and he told Trump before the election, if you win, I'll invest $100 billion in America. He's now going to invest $500 billion. Musk at the center of all this, Zuckerberg's rebirth. So it's actually if this is populism, my goodness, populism, as you understand it, right back to the beginnings of in South America and Perón and so on, was really when sort of some richer people employed, like Perón as a military officer got the sort of poor to rise up and go against the elites. This is the elites. And you can see some of the people who've been big on the sort of like World Economic Forum conspiracies and Bill Gates. And then Bill Gates is hanging out with Trump saying he's loving his program. So like this is fascinating. And if you look at the power centers of America, what you have now is you have an alignment. You have an American maximalist vision where Elon Musk is, and everyone got, saw his potential salute, or however you want to interpret that. But what people miss too is like, we're going to go to Mars. We're going to plant the American flag on Mars. This is very similar to the British Empire. When you had Cecil Rhodes, saying I would colonize other planets if I could get there and put the Union Jack on it.
Yeah.
So it's this American maximalism. We'll take Greenland, or whatever, Canada, or Alberta, or, Panama Canal again. But what's fascinating is behind that, it's not just Trump saying this. So you've got now Washington, the power that is Washington, Congress and the Senate. I know there's there, but they pretty much control them. You've got the president executive who's doing hundreds of executive orders, like a king. You've got Silicon Valley now, who literally Trump just announced today is AI, possibly the most powerful changing technology since the splitting of the atom. They now control that. You've got Wall Street has fallen in behind, all the big investment firms, and the Pentagon. So you now have a confluence of American political, military, economic, and technological power come together in a new order with a new maximalist vision in the world, which is America first. And a lot of Americans might hear that and go, oh, of course, that's our country. But for us in smaller countries, that's going to have a huge, huge effect. And look, my sense is I'll go back one step and then I'll make another point. So my first thing is, this is a challenge to China. Let's be clear what this is. This is America now has entered into full-blown economic war with China, tariffs, and again, to Trump reference politicians like McKinley in his speech, who was the president early on, who, very much had they called him the robber barons on his side and was expanding America. He was shot by an anarchist. So you got that sort of vision where China has entered into its production of EVs and going to an industrial base, and Trump has now changed America to meet that challenge. So it's a new economic war is emerging, and it's going to be a power world with winner takes all sort of dynamic. Whereas the previous model of American globalization was let's all rise together. China joins the World Economic Forum and the G8 or whatever, and like we rise, but Australia rises. You're our friends. We'll have an equal trade with you. You sell our beef, we'll sell the hot hamburgers or something, and that has radically changed now. So Canada, who would see, it's Silicon Valley wants the energy power of Canada because America doesn't have enough energy because it needs it for AI. These are the sort of very real world things. The second thing is, Biden at the end of his speech echoed, Eisenhower. Eisenhower, during World War II and World War I, but particularly in World War II, you really did see the American economy become a war economy. Mm-hmm. And a lot of the prosperity of America was because wars focus economies. You've seen that with Russia now. Everyone predicted Russia's collapse economically. They're ahead of some other European countries who are sanctioning them. And Eisenhower, in his final speech, which was televised, warned of the rise of a military-industrial complex. That there was America needed an army to fight the war, but then there's a danger that now becomes a thing and drives wars and drives technology and so on. And I think there was some truth in that. And Biden sort of echoed that, saying, "Well, there's now the rise of a techno-industrial complex wedded to power." Now, I think that's a very accurate statement. I always say, "Well, Biden, you also facilitated this, the tech giants were on your side for a stage there, and this has happened on your watch." So I think it's an accurate statement from someone who could have done something about it early on. And so I think where we're going from here is it's a new form of power in the world. It's a maximalist America, but we're now going to see a great power competition between two techno-industrial powers, China and America, and this is going to define the years to come.
What would you say the constraints of debt are on this?
Yes. Okay. So this is the other thing. This may be the vision and where we are with Trumpism now. Like I realized in the last few weeks, it's been perfect, and probably up till this week, it's the perfect scenario for Trump. You don't have to govern. You've got your winter White House in Mar-a-Lago, and you can just point the finger at Biden. You're watching the fires in California and pointing out the failures in governance. Say all the things you're going to do, enjoying everyone coming to your side, all the Silicon Valley, oligarchs coming to you, whatever. Day one's great. It's a big party, very presidential. You're there in the rotunda or whatever, and all your people are there in obsequience. He's signing all the decrees. But as we talked about before, there's a difference between campaigning and governance. Yeah. Okay, now the burden of governance is on them. We saw our Prime Minister, we saw the British Prime Minister win elections pretty convincingly, and then within a month or two, hugely disapproval ratings because they could not do anything about the core issue politically in the world, which is what we spoke about before, the crisis that the economic system is not working for people, cost of living, housing, and healthcare and so on. So the US under presidents, but particularly under, in the last few years, particularly under Trump won, Biden massively, and it's been about the accumulation of debt. America has a massive bill it has to pay because it wants to be preeminent in the arms race with China. So it pays a massive for arms and the army. It pays a massive amount in welfare, Medicaid and all this stuff. It has an aging population. And so there's a huge amount of welfare it pays. So it is hugely in debt. Like it's incredible. And there's a huge amount of money it's paying now to just debt repayments. And so obviously the change in the world with interest rates going down, we've also seen that printing money, we've spoken about this before, can create inflation. So Trump is absolutely caught between a rock and a hard place. So one of his answers for this is, well, we're going to have Doge. We're going to get new growth through cutting a lot of regulations and so on. But, I've seen some estimates that even if they do that to an incredible level, there's certain things you can't cut into. So he's still going to have to he's actually saying we'll spend more on the military. So you've got to find money to do that. You're not going to be politically grateful if you cut back on healthcare, cut back on welfare. Hugely unpopular in your populace when so many Americans rely on it. People are complaining about governance. So cutting government workers, there's actually not, like compared to compared to Australia and Britain, there's far less government workers in America.
Yeah, okay.
The government is smaller in comparison with some things. So Musk can cut some stuff, but it's not enough stuff that's going to make up the shortfall of this massive sort of fiscal, crisis of the burdening debt. Now, the other problem is his answer to this is, well, we'll cut taxes. We're going to get the American economy rocking by cutting taxes. However, cutting taxes can work if you're in surplus.
Yes.
But when you're in debt, those taxes are your revenue.
Yeah.
So all of a sudden you're like, well, we've got to pay back our debt. Well, we're going to have less money to do that. So that's going to be hugely troublesome. And then the other thing too is tariffs. Like no one, we've been in an era now where we've been a free trade era for a number of decades, and tariffs also can be highly inflationary. Because all of a sudden people are putting more. And if you and I are trading and I put tariffs on you, you're going to retaliate. So all of a sudden, America doesn't make everything. There's a lot of people in other countries providing stuff for Americans to have.
Yeah.
So what happens is, and the fact that, people are listening to this on devices, iPhones designed in California, but made where? In China or India or wherever. And not just iPhones. I mean, literally go around your house and turn things over and see where things are made. Everything's made in China. So you're about to enter into a trade war of tariffs with China. They are going to tariff you as well, and everything goes up. TVs have barely gone up in 20 years, and then all of a sudden, what if you're paying $8,000 for your laptop? What if you're paying 3 times the amount for a lounge suite, sofa, whatever? So this is going to be hugely inflationary. So we're at maximalist American vision now. We're going to go to the moon. We're going to have AI. We're going to have robots doing our work. That's sort of the vision. But what happens is there's very little that you saw yesterday in the inauguration which addressed how they're going to get to the cost of living. And you're saying we're going to get the cost of living crisis down. Well, how? How? By stimulating the economy. Okay, there's a number. So this is where we go back to there's still massive structural issues in the world. And so that's why I say, like, the vibe shift, be very wary of charting. I mean, maybe we'll talk about this. I'll leave that one there. So that's going to be a massive constraint on his ability to do all of this.
Yeah.
Yeah. And I mean, I have no doubt investment will go up. Like we just saw with the SoftBank guy bringing $500. Wall Street's going to deal with this, but can they deal with that initial thing that Mark Carney said? The system's not working.
Well, with all of this in mind, we are obviously a podcast that speaks to Christian leaders across the world. What does this mean for churches? Yeah,
I would encourage people, again, we're speaking very early days, but a new order is emerging. I think back to podcast John Montgomery and I did called This Cultural Moment, which is really getting people's heads around the changes that were happening in sort of 2015, 2016. We're going to be at another one now. And so things are going to change. The way that people would do their announcements in 2013 that they didn't then do in 2017 in certain places in the world because of your public messaging, all this sort of stuff, the culture change, it's now going to shift.
Yeah.
And I think even people have sort of like adapted to the message of this cultural moment and tried to sort of position themselves and understand they're in a secular environment. What does it look like when very rapidly you might go from a secular environment to a cultural Christian environment very quickly or something unrecognizable? And this is not, I don't know, many people of our American listeners are very attuned to this conversation. But also I'm going to say it's going to be also for, if you're in Palmerston North in New Zealand, this is going to affect you because your young people are watching Joe Rogan. Do you know what I mean? They are connected to all this stuff. The Gen Zs in your church are more attuned to this than the boomers who may read, the local paper. So what does it look like when the energy of the right is increasingly in the young? We're not used to this. Interestingly, the fashion shows in New York this year, there was an article in The Age, which was our local paper, and it was reviewing the New York fashion stuff. And it's like the gender binary is back, gender fluids out, the fashion brands that are sort of doing trad wife, doing all this sort of stuff. I think you're going to see a very huge move towards conservatism in certain areas.
Yeah.
And so your messaging, how you talk in different things, how you've learned to talk over the last few years, that's going to change very quickly. I can't predict all of it, and some of that could be wrong. So the second thing I would say, and I'll leave the most juiciest to last. People who run denominations, people who run organizations, and I think we talked about Nate Silver's book where he talked about the village and the river, that there's sort of these two worlds now, sort of safety and risk. And really, you'd almost put it's regulation and risk. I think you're going to see an increased backlash against proceduralism in the church. So, for example, it was just really interesting. I saw John Milbank, the theologian, make some comments. There was a scandal in the Church of England. Archbishop of Canterbury stepped down, and in response to some of the abuse that happened in the church, Britain, very similar to our country, had done a lot of safeguarding. They call it in the UK, we call it safe churches, a lot of proceduralism, training for staff and so on. And Milbank sort of made the comment, he's like, we've done all this training, all this proceduralism. So, two old ladies in a parish somewhere in England have got to go through all this stuff if they want to do ministry now. But then at the highest levels, there was stuff that was happening and these proceduralism didn't change anything. That's me paraphrasing.
Yes.
And we're hearing here increasingly, people just going, oh man, to do a church now is so much proceduralism, so much stuff. It's like hard to do ministry,
Yeah.
I think you're going to see a pushback on that, and I think that the sort of thing between regulation and risk, you're going to see a move back towards risk. And so what am I saying? I'm not saying like get rid of all the things. I think there's some really important things the church did poorly in the past around risk, but then also like it's going to be really hard to plant gutsy, brave church plants that are overregulated with things. So how do we do that, Mark? I don't know. Don't send me an email. Like, can you come and tell us how to do that? I don't know. I'm just saying that I think you're going to see a cultural shift, a move from overregulation back to risk. That's going to happen in church cultures, mission agencies, etc. But let me just leave you with all the last one. I think woke will continue in some form. It's like, you have some new genre of dance music and it becomes massive and it never goes away. It just becomes much smaller and some people in some small clubs listen to it and there's some, bespoke Spotify playlists, but it's not the big thing. So there's going to always be woke stuff and it's going to continue to have some form of resistance. But the sort of epoch of what we've experienced the last few years of where the powers in the power elite aligned with that ideology, that is over. It's done. So if you're defining yourself against that, I think it's going to quickly vanish. That's not to say all the issues vanish, but it's going to vanish.
Sure.
What is going to rise in its wake is techno-utopianism. And I think that the challenge for a lot of people who perhaps may be cheering on some of the changes in Trumpism, and maybe you don't like Trump, but maybe like, oh, it's good to see that, Trump makes there's only two genders comment and you're sort of clapping and I don't like the bloke, but at least he's done that. And the real challenge comes when some of these people, like an Elon Musk who is talking about putting chips in your brain that you can control, some of these people who have a techno-utopian view of the future where society is run by artificial intelligence and the questions of what it is to be human, where does power lie, are going to be really key. So my little line, I thought this is, you're going to hear less about transgenderism, you're going to hear more about transhumanism. And so the questions you may be talking in only a few years may be questions around people in your congregation who want to merge with technology in new ways, less around other stuff. And that's what we need to sort of prepare for. And, I think about, I'd read a number of people have sent in, have you read this, that Hideous Strength, the Lewis book? And I actually read it recently because so many people sent it in. I know I should have read it years ago, but I hadn't. But his sort of vision in that, it's worth reading, is almost of this government corporate entity which has this sort of techno-utopian, dystopian sort of rule. You know, it comes into this British college town. They sort of let it in. They're running out of money, so they get sponsorship and they sort of redo this town. And you know, that book really wrestles. It's a wild book. My goodness. And you know, he sort of talks about there's almost a paganism at the heart of it. And you know, there is a paganism at the heart of some of these people. And because I've read a lot of the stuff, you know, there's visions of what it would look like. And, you know, again, when I talk about now, maybe talk about in a few years, even some of the UFO stuff, you can see there's this weird techno-mystical paganism. So I'm not saying to freak out now. I'm not saying like the beast is here and it's a techno-beast or anything like that. But I am saying the church's challenge, I think, which there's a lot of people who just got their head around the fact that and the city's now secular and we're dealing with some of the stuff we talk about in this cultural moment. And it's going to be whiplash. I'm sorry, but this is how fast things are moving. So I think that's the sort of work we need to do, you know, like, and again, I mean, at 20,000 emails, I've just written a book on platforms. So that's one thing that's coming out April 1st. Digital platforms and our response to them, one part of it. But I think that's increasingly, like the woke culture war is pretty much over. It's like D-Day, to use your D-Day analogy. Berlin has not fallen, but D-Day has been won. So they'll be mopping up operations, but the war's effectively over. But the next battle is, I think, techno-utopianism, transhumanism, and who are the people of God? What is it to be human? What is it to create in the image of God? Going forward in this world, that's going to really be, and what may be difficult is, yes, the people who maybe you liked because they got rid of some of the old order, maybe the people you need to resist in the next order.
Big times ahead. Well, any further comments from you, Daniel?
I'm just going to go to bed for a week. It's really helpful, Mark. Appreciate it.
Yeah. Thank you again, Mark, for taking us through that. Let's be the people of God and continue to pray for our world. Particularly for America at this time. But for your own nations, your neighboring nations, let's be praying. And it's good to be back.
It's good to be back.
Oh,
yeah.
Missed you guys and chatting this stuff through.
Yeah, it's good.
Miss our audience.
Aw.
Bless yous.
We met some people here and there, didn't we?
We did,
I did.
yeah,
I did
yeah.
met some people over the holidays. Bumped into some people, which is good. Yeah.
Well, we look forward to bringing you more episodes in the year to come. Thanks for joining us.